Emily and Jake were just ordinary kids in Maplewood, riding bikes and playing in the park, unaware that a calculated predator was watching their every move, waiting for the perfect moment to lure them into danger. The town of Maplewood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other. Names and neighbors greeted one another with friendly waves. Streets were lined with tall oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze, and the small parks were filled with children riding bicycles, tossing balls, and laughing as if nothing could disturb the peace. On the surface, it seemed like a safe and predictable community, the kind of town where parents felt confident letting their kids play outside without worry. But beneath this calm exterior, subtle signs of unease began to emerge, unnoticed at first, until they started to build into something that could no longer be ignored. It began with small incidents, easily dismissed by most adults. Parents noticed that their children occasionally returned home carrying candy they hadn't been given permission to have, or they mentioned brief encounters with strangers offering rides to a local park. At first, it seemed harmless. After all, people sometimes handed out treats, and children were naturally curious. But over time, the reports grew more frequent, more specific, and more troubling. Parents began to share stories with each other quietly, in hushed tones over backyard fences or at school pickup lines. There was a pattern emerging, a thread that tied these seemingly random interactions together, but the adults couldn't yet see its full shape. Children who were usually carefree started showing signs of unease. Some became hesitant to walk certain streets. Others glanced nervously over their shoulders when playing outside. One girl mentioned a man standing at the edge of the playground, watching her, and her voice trembled even as she tried to make it sound ordinary. Another child said a man had promised to take them to a secret fun place if they followed him. The words seemed innocent enough when spoken aloud, but the implication was chilling. Parents began to feel a sense of dread that the town they trusted so completely might be harboring something dangerous. The adults of Maplewood started to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere. The parks, once filled with laughter and the sounds of children playing, grew quieter as parents pulled their kids closer. The streets that had been safe for generations began to feel eerie, as though the town itself was holding its breath. Even the local convenience store where children had gone to buy ice cream with friends became a place of caution, with parents watching their children's every step. People began to talk about strangers with suspicion, and every unfamiliar face drew a cautious glance. Despite the growing unease, the town remained outwardly calm. Life went on in routines with school, work, and daily errands, but an invisible tension hung over the community. Parents whispered warnings to one another, and the children, sensing the anxiety, began to behave differently. It was the kind of tension that could not be seen in a single moment but built steadily, like the slow tightening of a coil. Maplewood's idyllic facade was cracking, revealing the possibility that beneath the familiar faces and quiet streets, something sinister had started to take root. Something that would soon challenge the safety the town had always taken for granted. Even as life continued on the surface, the subtle signs of danger could no longer be ignored. Parents and neighbors alike felt that instinctive, gnawing suspicion that something was not right, that their children were at risk, and that the ordinary calm of Maplewood might be about to shatter in ways no one could have anticipated. The sense of unease in Maplewood intensified as reports of the stranger's behavior became harder to dismiss. Authorities began to trace the incidents back to a single individual, a man who had recently moved into a weathered house at the edge of the neighborhood. The house itself seemed unremarkable at first glance, with peeling paint and an overgrown yard, blending into the quiet suburban landscape. Yet for the families living nearby, it quickly became a place of suspicion. Children who had played in the vicinity began avoiding the area, their parents noticing anxious glances and sudden reluctance when passing by. The man was rarely seen during the day, but when he did appear, there was a calculated patience in the way he lingered near playgrounds and sidewalks, always observing, always waiting. Neighbors started noticing a pattern in his movements. He would often be present in public spaces where children were known to gather, sometimes sitting on benches or leaning against walls, appearing to read or watch, though it was clear that his attention was fixed on the children. On several occasions, he would position himself near school bus stops, not to board the bus but to watch the children arrive and leave. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to someone unfamiliar with his intent. Yet parents who had become alert to the situation recognized the behavior as predatory. Rumors began to circulate, small murmurs of worry that something was deeply wrong, but no one wanted to accuse the man outright without proof. Investigators soon discovered that the suspect had a criminal record involving sexual offenses, immediately escalating the concern and urgency of the case. The revelation shocked the community, as the realization settled in that a man with a dangerous past was living so close to their children. This knowledge turned fear into vigilance, with parents now monitoring every movement in the streets and parks. Children who had once roamed freely were now closely accompanied by adults, their routines altered by the invisible presence of the stranger. The man's actions, though still subtle, now carried the weight of a known threat, and the entire neighborhood began to feel a quiet, pervasive tension. As authorities delved deeper, they uncovered disturbing signs of calculated manipulation. The suspect seemed to understand the routines of the community and the habits of its children. He had learned which families allowed their kids to play unsupervised, which routes the children took to school, and which parks were most frequently visited. His actions suggested premeditation, a carefully orchestrated effort to position himself where he could observe without raising suspicion. Surveillance footage, combined with witness reports, painted a picture of a man who blended into the background, yet remained intensely focused on his target. The community watched anxiously as investigators began compiling evidence. Parents exchanged information about sightings, suspicious interactions, and minor incidents that had seemed insignificant at the time. Every detail mattered, and the collective vigilance of Maplewood slowly began to form a network of awareness that the suspect could not easily evade. Yet despite the growing knowledge of his past and present actions, there was a chilling uncertainty about what he might attempt next. The quiet neighborhood, once considered safe, had become a landscape of tension and suspicion, with a lurking threat that was patient, observant, and calculated in ways the town had never encountered before. As the investigation deepened, authorities uncovered the extent of the suspect's manipulative tactics. It became clear that he was not relying solely on his presence in the neighborhood to target children. He had expanded his reach using social media and texting, creating fake profiles designed to appear friendly and trustworthy. These profiles portrayed him as a local volunteer, a teenager interested in gaming, or a neighbor looking to connect with kids for fun activities. The goal was simple but dangerous: establish trust, create a sense of familiarity, and lure children to his house without raising alarm. Parents were stunned to learn that he had been using technology as a tool to extend his predatory reach far beyond the streets and parks where he had been physically observed. The patterns were chilling. Investigators found messages offering rides to secret locations, promises of treats, and invitations to games that could only be experienced at his home. Each communication was carefully constructed, written in a tone meant to appeal to children, coaxing them to take small steps toward danger. Even when a child refused initially, the messages were persistent, designed to wear down resistance and exploit curiosity. It was a methodical process, a calculated manipulation that demonstrated knowledge of how children think and how they respond to attention and rewards. The realization that these interactions were occurring behind the screens that children often used daily added a new layer of fear for the community. Authorities traced attempts to meet at local parks, playgrounds, and even near schools. In each case, the suspect had created situations where a child might feel safe accepting an offer, using the promise of fun or treats as bait. Detectives reviewed footage, followed leads, and mapped out the suspect's movements in painstaking detail. The danger was constant. Every failed attempt brought him closer to refining his strategy for the next. Parents reported that children were being approached in increasingly subtle ways, sometimes receiving messages in the middle of the day, sometimes after school, always at moments when supervision was lighter. The neighborhood, once filled with carefree laughter, now had an invisible tension hovering over it, as adults realized how quickly a moment of distraction could turn into a life-threatening situation. The investigation revealed a more sinister aspect of the suspect's planning. He had already attempted contact with several children, sometimes narrowly avoiding detection. Each failed attempt seemed to embolden him, increasing his patience and careful observation. Detectives realized that waiting for a misstep could be catastrophic. Proactive intervention was essential. They began coordinating with schools and families, educating children on how to recognize suspicious behavior while collecting evidence to support a legal case. Undercover surveillance became a central tactic, with officers creating controlled situations to observe the suspect's behavior firsthand. Every detail mattered: the time of day, the route taken, the types of messages sent, and the language used to lure children. As the web of the suspect's manipulation became clear, it was apparent that the danger extended beyond a single individual. The methodical approach, the careful attention to timing and opportunity, and the use of both physical presence and digital communication indicated a level of planning that was chilling in its precision. The community realized that the threat was patient, cunning, and willing to exploit every avenue available to reach vulnerable children. Maplewood was no longer just a quiet town. It had become the stage for a careful, calculated battle to protect its youngest residents from a predator who had made observation, deception, and manipulation the core of his plan. Detectives worked tirelessly to piece together the full extent of the suspect's activities, knowing that every detail could prevent another child from being put in harm's way. They coordinated closely with schools, local businesses, and families, gathering information about sightings, strange encounters, and online interactions. Each report was carefully logged, cross-referenced, and analyzed. The man's movements were mapped meticulously, and patterns began to emerge that revealed the depth of his planning. It was clear that he had studied the neighborhood and its routines, taking note of when children were most likely to be unsupervised and which areas provided the easiest access to potential victims. The investigation uncovered an even more disturbing revelation. The suspect was not acting entirely alone. Authorities discovered communications that suggested the involvement of a second person, someone who assisted in creating distractions and luring children into vulnerable situations. This accomplice operated in subtle ways, ensuring the suspect's presence went unnoticed and manipulating situations to increase his access to children. The discovery of a partner in the crimes added a new layer of complexity to the case. Investigators realized that the danger was greater than initially believed, and that swift, strategic action was necessary to prevent further attempts at luring. To gather evidence, the police implemented surveillance operations around key locations where previous attempts had occurred. Officers disguised themselves as parents, volunteers, and community members, keeping a constant watch over parks, playgrounds, and school drop-off points. Every movement of the suspect was recorded, from the way he observed children to the moments when he attempted to approach them. Meanwhile, specialists monitored his online activity, tracking messages, digital profiles, and any interaction with children that could serve as proof of intent. Each step of the operation required patience, as investigators knew that any misstep could alert the suspect and compromise the safety of potential victims. As the investigation progressed, detectives pieced together a detailed profile of the suspect. He was methodical and patient, often retreating when a plan seemed likely to fail, only to return with a new approach later. The accomplice's involvement indicated a deliberate escalation in tactics, making the predator more dangerous and unpredictable. Authorities realized that they were dealing with a highly organized individual, capable of manipulating both physical environments and digital communication to create opportunities for abuse. The evidence painted a chilling picture of a man willing to exploit every possible advantage to achieve his goals, showing no regard for the harm he could cause to children or families. Community members grew increasingly anxious as updates from investigators trickled in. Parents became hypervigilant, closely monitoring their children's interactions and movements, while law enforcement worked to balance public safety with the need to maintain secrecy around surveillance operations. The tension in Maplewood was palpable, with a sense of urgency pressing down on both investigators and families. Every day that passed without intervention was another opportunity for the suspect to act. The painstaking work of law enforcement, combined with the cooperation of the community, was essential to prevent tragedy. The case had become a race against time, each piece of evidence bringing detectives closer to a moment when the predator could finally be confronted and stopped. The final phase of the investigation required precision, coordination, and patience. Detectives devised a controlled operation to catch the suspect in the act, using a decoy child and undercover officers to create a situation that would reveal his intentions without putting anyone at risk. The streets, parks, and sidewalks that had once been ordinary spaces for children's play were now carefully monitored, with officers positioned strategically to observe every movement. The suspect had grown bold in his attempts, but the authorities were ready, waiting for the exact moment when he would make a critical mistake that would allow them to intervene. On the chosen night, the operation unfolded with tense precision. The decoy child, carefully briefed and accompanied by undercover officers disguised as everyday adults, was placed in a location the suspect had previously targeted. Surveillance teams monitored from a distance, ready to respond at the first sign of an approach. The suspect appeared, moving with the same calculated patience that investigators had observed for weeks. He lingered, scanning the area, checking for observers, and then finally took a step toward the decoy, signaling his intent. At that moment, officers moved in with speed and authority, surrounding him and taking him into custody before he could reach the child. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Families who had been living under a cloud of fear were relieved, though the anxiety and tension of the past weeks had left a lasting mark. As investigators processed the scene and gathered evidence from the suspect's house, computers, and devices, the scale of his planning became clear. Text messages, social media profiles, and logs of interactions with children demonstrated the premeditation behind his actions. Authorities also discovered clear links to the accomplice who had assisted in creating distractions and aiding the suspect's attempts to lure children. This second arrest followed quickly, bringing a sense of closure to the immediate threat. In the days that followed, Maplewood began the slow process of recovery. Parents shared stories of vigilance, cooperation, and the moments that had allowed investigators to intervene before a tragedy occurred. Law enforcement emphasized the importance of awareness, communication, and the role of community in protecting children. Schools implemented additional safety protocols, and parents remained cautious, reinforcing lessons about stranger danger and online safety with their children. The town had been shaken, but the event served as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance in even the safest communities. The case left a lasting impression on Maplewood. The streets, once quiet and taken for granted, carried an invisible memory of the threat that had lurked there, patient and calculated. Families became more attentive, neighbors more connected, and the community as a whole more aware of the dangers that could hide in plain sight. The suspect and his accomplice faced the full weight of the law, but the lessons of their actions extended far beyond the courtroom. Maplewood would never forget the tension, fear, and relief that had defined those weeks, and the story of the predator who tried to manipulate children became a permanent reminder of the need for constant vigilance and protection. Though the arrests marked the end of immediate danger, the impact of the case lingered. Parents watched over their children with renewed attention, schools strengthened their safety measures, and law enforcement remained alert, knowing that vigilance was the key to preventing similar threats in the future. The community's sense of security had been tested, but through cooperation, careful planning, and decisive action, Maplewood had survived a calculated threat that could have destroyed the innocence of its children. The story served as a stark illustration of both the dangers that can lurk unnoticed and the power of a community united in protection.